Today, I'm going to explain a war thriller movie called 13 Minutes. Spoilers ahead. Watch out and take care. The movie opens as a German worker named Georg Elser packs some homemade dynamite sticks inside a stone pillar. He then checks the clockwork mechanism of the time bomb he has made and covers the hole in the pillar. George makes sure everything is well hidden so that nobody suspects what is about to happen. Meanwhile, it appears that he has injured himself while putting things together. There are several cuts on his hand and discomfort in his knees. It is late in the night of November 7th, 1939, and George is currently in Bürgerbraukeller. I think that means Mayor Brown Basement, a huge beer hall in Munich, Germany. This place is soon going to host a lot of high-ranking officials from the Nazi Party. George finishes his work and guesses where his target will take a seat, knowing that the explosives are directly behind the podium. He exits the building. The scene abruptly shifts to a day later on November 8th, 1939 in the same place. Adolf Hitler, the German Chancellor, and the assassination target, is welcomed to the podium by his peers. He is there to deliver his annual speech commemorating the failed coup attempt by the Nazi Party to overthrow the Weimar Republic 16 years ago. He is standing on the podium right in front of the pillar where the homemade time bomb is placed. Elsewhere, in the city of Konstanz, George frantically checks his pocket watch before making his way towards the German-Swiss border. He is about to cross the border fence when suddenly he gets called out by two German officers. George clarifies that he is searching for his acquaintance from the local folklore society, but the officers are unsure about his motives, as he has a wire cutter in his hands. Shortly afterwards, they take George to their station and confiscate everything he is carrying. This includes several incriminating pieces of evidence, like the wire cutter and the blueprint for the building. George keeps on peering at a wall clock while being searched. The time is 9 p.m. He knows that it's just a matter of time before the explosion happens. Suddenly, an officer sees the badge of the far-left Communist Party red front on his coat's lapel. George is told that wearing such an insignia is illegal and is forced to face the wall. The Nazi officer soon notices that the suspect has several injuries and puts him behind bars right away. George grabs his pocket watch, almost trembling with anxiety as he looks at the time. At exactly 9:20 p.m., a vast explosion ensues in Munich. George remains seated in the holding station, not knowing if the assassination is a success or not. Elsewhere, an officer at the Reich Security main office is told about the events that have just taken place in Munich. The relative calm changes into chaos as soldiers are put in full alert. On the other hand, George's village is being approached by a convoy led by the Kripo police chief, Arthur Nebe. He orders the local Nazi party leader, Eberle, to summon all of George Elser's relatives in the town square. Eberle is surprised by this command as he knows that the Elsers are decent, law-abiding citizens. However, Nebe seems to be extremely furious and wants his order followed by any means. Soon the authorities find George's family, including his ex-fiancée Elsa. She and her two kids are placed under arrest and loaded into the back of a truck, but Eberle intervenes at the last moment and takes the kids back to safety. Sometime later, Nebe checks the footage of the aftermath of the explosion with his officers. He's blown away by the sheer amount of damage that's been caused. In the next scene, George is handcuffed and brought into an investigation office in Berlin. He quickly notices some torture paraphernalia placed on a nearby table. Nebe and several other officers also arrive in the room, but George refuses to greet them with the Nazi salute. He instead makes a point by choosing the more neutral greeting, "Good day." "Und wie geht's, mein Lieblingsmann?" Nonetheless, Nebe introduces himself and informs George that he's in charge of this case. He also introduces Gestapo head Heinrich Müller, who will be overseeing the investigation along with him. Nebe wants to see George's knees and orders him to take his pants off. The latter obliges, and we see that George's knees are bruised heavily. This seemingly confirms the police chief's suspicions. George did install the bomb himself. Then, Nebe informs the suspect that Hitler is still alive, but the explosion claimed the lives of 7 innocent people. It turns out the Führer had left the event 13 minutes before the bomb detonated. This revelation devastates George, as it was his only opportunity to kill Hitler. Müller then starts the formal questioning by asking George his full name and birthplace, but instead of answering, George begins to hum a tune that takes him into a flashback. He mentally travels to 1932, when he he is enjoying himself at Lake Constance with his pals. George is a skilled woodworker and an accordion player who leads a modest but content life. He currently works in a small watchmaking factory in the city of Constance. One afternoon, George receives a letter telling him that his alcoholic father has sold 2 fields. One of these is the most valuable piece of land that his family owns. George is thus forced to go back home to sort out some personal matters. A few days later, he arrives in his hometown of Königsbrunn, a farming village in the south of Germany. He greets his mother with a warm hug, while his completely intoxicated father is knocked out on a bench nearby. Later that afternoon, while chopping wood in the backyard, George notices his father fetching a jug of cider. He can no longer tolerate this and confronts the old man about the drinking habit.
Take a look at yourself, man.
Back in the present day, Mueller is less than happy with George zoning out. He slaps him and gives him one more chance to tell his name and place of birth, but George is unfazed by this and refuses to utter even a single word. So, Mueller has him restrained on a bed and begins the torture. George yells in pain as an officer brutally whips him, but he still refuses to open his mouth. Sometime later, the torture stops for the time being, and George is thrown into a cell. Neba and Mueller debate on how to get the suspect to write a written confession about his crimes. Neba then requests a list of his family members who have been taken into custody. He seems to have an idea about how to mentally break the suspect. A few hours later, a bloodied and heavily bruised George is back in the interrogation room. Neba brings in Elsa, a married woman who George dated for several months. The suspect immediately realizes what the police will do to her if he does not open his mouth. Thus, he decides to own up to what he did and gives out his personal details. George points out that he is not affiliated to any political party and acted all on his own. Neba refuses to believe this, as he was caught wearing a red front badge, but George replies that he is a free man and does not need to be affiliated with any party to do the right thing. After the first round of investigation, Neba and Mueller print the suspect's statement and present it to a parliamentarian, but even the latter refuses to believe that George acted on his own. Neba is thus forced to admit that there is not enough evidence to prove that someone else ordered the bombing, but the parliamentarian wants them to intensify their investigation. A few days later, George writes a confession letter detailing what he did and how he did it. Both Neba and Mueller, however, categorically refuse to believe it. They want to know where he got the materials to build the bomb and who gave him the order to carry out the assassination. Frustrated that they refuse to believe him, George makes up an elaborate fake story. He says that he received a call from Winston Churchill, who personally asked him to kill Hitler. This irritates the officers, and Mueller orders his men to tie the suspect once more. George is fully aware of what kind of torture is about to follow, so he desperately asks for a pen and paper to illustrate how he carried out his plan. The scene then shifts to a few years ago, when George is in a Königsbrunn pub with his friends. Eric, local businessman and Elsa's husband, comes in with a bruised face. He joins his friend with a glass of beer and admits that it was his wife who gave him the bruise. He then proudly claims that she will never even think about raising her hand again. Sensing that Elsa might be badly hurt, George hurries to her home, only to find her lying on the bed. She is sobbing her eyes out and has a deep bruise on the right side of her face. A concerned George tries to comfort her, and Elsa leans forward to kiss him. It is then revealed that the two have been building an intense romantic chemistry for several months. Thus, the duo ends up making love and formally begins their affair. Back in the Nazi jail, George details to Neba about how he was able to accumulate the gunpowder from the steel factory where he worked. He also divulges that he was able to steal the materials for the dynamite from a nearby quarry. Neba wants George to admit that he's covering for someone else, but the latter is very firm that he acted alone. To prove his point, George shows how he made 2 clockworks and a detonator that ultimately triggered the explosion. As the intense questioning and torture goes on, George also dips in and out of his memories. One beautiful afternoon, while they are out on a picnic, Elsa reveals that she is pregnant, but she isn't quite sure if the baby belongs to George or her abusive alcoholic husband Eric.
It'll be easy, honey. We'll just wait and see if the baby looks like a piece of shit.
On the other hand, the Nazi propaganda is slowly beginning to poison the hearts and minds of people in rural Germany. There are Nazi party members everywhere, and anyone who dissents is thrown in jail. George and his friend Joseph, who is a member of the Red Front opposition party, regularly listen to Soviet news on their radio. They find out that Hitler recently ordered the bombing of a Spanish town, killing 260 innocent civilians. This infuriates George, and he wants to put a stop to it, but he soon learns that Hitler is planning to attack Poland. Things also begin to go downhill in his personal life when Eric catches George making out with his wife. At this point in time, George is renting in the basement of Eric's home and regularly making love with Elsa. An infuriated Eric then throws his wife to the floor and brutally kicks her pregnant belly. But George responds strongly by grabbing a knife and threatening to kill the alcoholic husband if he doesn't stop. Weeks pass by, and while there is turmoil in his personal life, George begins to plan how to carry out the assassination. He collects news articles that show Hitler giving speeches every year at the Bürgerbraukeller in Munich. Behind the podium is a giant Nazi party flag covering a solid pillar. George heads to Munich, waits until the venue is empty, and sneaks inside the hall. He goes behind the stage to get an accurate dimension of the pillar that would be required to carry out his plan. Back in the interrogation room, George expresses his disgust about Hitler and his policies. Salaries are low, protesters are sent to concentration camps, and Jews are being discriminated against because of their faith. George adds that there will be consequences to what Hitler is doing, and it will lead to Germany's downfall. Following this latest round of questioning, his typewritten confession is finalized. Neba is now convinced that George was on his own when the attack was executed, but Mueller still believes there is a huge conspiracy behind the attack. While the two are discussing their next move, George begs a secretary to send a message to Elsa and his family. He also wants to send condolences to the family of people who got killed in the explosion. The secretary then hands Elsa's photo to George and asks him not to tell anybody that he got it from her. Upon seeing the photo, George goes into a flashback to the time when Elsa gives birth to their son. She even names the baby George and is ready to divorce her abusive husband. However, this doesn't stop George from his determination to carry out his plan. He keeps honing his skill to perfect the execution of the bombing. For a trial run, he puts a replica bomb on a tree in a remote area. The explosion is massive and blows the entire tree to smithereens. Ich bin zum Tod geworden, zum Zerstörer der Welten. Back in the present, the parliamentarian storms into the interrogation room and slams George's face on the table repeatedly after hearing what he said about their leader, Hitler. We also get to see that Neba is now starting to question the motives of the Nazi Party's superiors, but does not dare to act on it. The parliamentarian then instructs Neba and Mueller to do whatever it takes to find out whom George got the order from. With the mounting pressure, George is tied down and given the secret hallucinogen, Pervitin. The officers then ask a sedated George who ordered the bombings, but the latter once again repeats his statement. Sometime later, George awakens from his hallucination and decides to change his tone. He acknowledges that he now wants to right his mistakes and reintegrate into the German community. George says that the assassination was unsuccessful purely because his motives were not correct. After this statement, he is taken to the concentration camp in Dachau. 5 years later, Neba is sentenced to death for his part in an assassination attempt to kill Hitler. He is executed by means of hanging in the Dachau concentration camp. George learns about the fate of Neba from Franz, a disabled prison guard. George is surprised, but also wants to know where Elsa is, as he believes that she might still be alive somewhere. Although empathetic, Franz knows that there's nothing he can do about it. He simply gives George some music sheets to play on his zither, a musical instrument, as a token of appreciation. As the film closes, George is told by Franz that 100,000 people perished in a single night after England destroyed one of their cities. George regrets it, since he knows that if his strategy had succeeded, this could have been avoided. He is soon taken out of his cell by more guards, and Mueller gives the order for his execution. The movie is based on true events.